Hello everyone. The topic that I would like to discuss with you is a continuation about the moral theory entitled Ethics of Utilitarianism. As an introduction, as previously discussed, utilitarianism is a moral principle that holds that the morally right course of action in any situation is the one that produces the greatest balance of benefits over harms for everyone affected. So, as long as a course of action produces maximum benefits for everyone, utilitarianism does not care whether the benefits are produced by lies or dishonesty or manipulation or coercion or violence. Moreover, many of us use this type of moral reasoning frequently in our daily decisions when asked to explain why we feel we have a moral duty to perform some actions. We often point to the good that will come from the action or the harm it will prevent. So in other words, we always consider the consequence of the act. Okay. Now this is the principle of this theory, the principle of utility, and Bentham described utility as that property in any object which tends to produce benefit, advantage, good, or happiness. So by utility we mean the usefulness in achieving happiness. So when we speak of utility principle is a principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Likewise, John Stuart Mill defines this doctrine as follows: the creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. So, by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Okay. Now the question is, how are we going to measure greatest happiness over pain? That's why Jeremy Bentham introduced this what we call the hedonic calculus. So what is this hedonic calculus? It is a method of working out the sum total of pleasure and pain produced by an act, and thus the total value of its consequences. So it is also called the philosophic calculus. As I have said, it is being sketched by Bentham. So here are the variables of hedonic calculus. As we all know, it helps choose the good thing to do and work out the possible consequences of an action. So we have an acronym PRICE. So the first variable is purity. So how free from pain is it? So it is referring here to the act, the consequence. And then next is the remoteness. So how near is it? And then next is richness. To what extent it will lead to other pleasure? So that's the question. And then intensity, how powerful is it? And then certainty is referring to how likely it is to result in pleasure. And then the extent is how many people does it affect. So, and then the last one is the duration, how long will it last. This is the motto of this theory: the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So this motto is the measure of right or wrong, and this is very important to distinguish this theory from egoism, which only caters the self, the individual self, but not the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So this is what distinguishes this theory from egoism. Okay. John Stuart Mill was troubled by some criticisms of this theory. So one of its criticism is about quality and quantity. This is about physical pleasure and spiritual pleasure. So in his words, one of the objections to this theory is that Mill was troubled because of the charge that it is based on a low view of humankind. It makes pleasure the measure of value, and it seems to put all human pleasures, from philosophical contemplation to drunkenness, on the same level. So, and this is attributed because of Bentham when he said that it is the quantity, not the type of pleasure, that matters. So this really creates criticisms about this theory, no? So in order to defend utilitarianism, it is against this charge of Philistinism, meaning there is Mill develops a doctrine of higher pleasure. So for Mill, people will prefer the pleasures of thought, feeling, and imagination to pleasures of the body and the senses. Even though these capacities bring new kinds of pain, but it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So here it is the happiness that we have to achieve is not about the sensual desire, but those higher pleasures which is more than the sensual satisfaction, no? That's why according to Mill, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, or we can say better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So no human uh, would exchange his higher capacities for a life of just a lower satisfaction. Just as Socrates preferred his own death to a life bereft of philosophy. Like, it's just like trying to choose whether to give up your faith for these material things, or remain in your faith but were able to save your own soul. So that is what it means by Mill when he said higher pleasure, the contemplations of the spiritual life and also our mental capacity. At this point, let us talk about the strengths of utilitarianism. So here we have around 8 strengths points of the strengths of utilitarianism. Number 1 is the idea of happiness. It seems right that happiness is given intrinsic value. So it's not just the act itself, but here what is given priority is the happiness. Next is utilitarianism seems to be in line with our intuitions that harming people is intrinsically wrong. So that's the beauty. This is again another the beauty of utilitarianism. And then greatest good. It does follow from the above that the right course of action is the one that leads to the most happiness and least harm. So that's greatest good, no? And then it's easy to use, no? Weighing up the positive and negative effects of our action is straightforward. Next is that it is secular, no? Utilitarianism does not rely on specific beliefs about God. And then it is democratic. The fairest way to run a country is to balance everyone's differing interests. And then it is objective. The positive and negative consequences of our actions can be measured. And lastly, it is universal. The principle of utility, reducing harm and increasing happiness, is universal and applies in every culture. So these are the strengths of utilitarianism. On the other hand, here are the weaknesses of utilitarianism. Number one is, what about other goods? No, happiness is not the only thing that is of intrinsic worth, but also other goods, other values. No, it's not just about happiness. And then this theory is that violates the principle that the ends don't justify the means. Because imagine I killed one healthy person and gave their organs to save 5 others. It is not really acceptable. Next is, it is unpredictable. You can't actually know what is going to happen in the future, so it is wrong to base our ethical choices on what may or may not come about in the future. Next is, it is immeasurable. You can't assign a value to an amount of pleasure. And then next, people can't be trusted. No, if you get rid of rules and allow people to choose to act in the greater good, they will actually act selfishly, then try to justify their actions by claiming they were in the greater good. Next is, it is wrong. Utilitarianism is just wrong about ethics. Next is, it is subjective. We have different definitions of happiness. No? Happiness is subjective. And lastly, there is this tyranny of the majority. For example, if most people feel strongly against homosexuality, this would justify laws against practicing homosexuality. Okay, so short evaluation, overall, the weakness outweighs the strengths because in this theory, it does not take into account the feelings or happiness of the minority. And also, how can we measure pleasure? You can't add a value towards it. So as you can see in this theory, it is really the complete opposite of the natural law theory and even the teachings of Jesus Christ, no, about forgiveness. If you still remember the account when one of the 99 was lost, no? And you have to leave behind the 99 and look for one that is lost, no? So, and in our society, it is really difficult to imagine that a criminal is going to be protected by our constitution when it has a lot of it creates a lot of chaos, perhaps those who are victims of crimes. So instead of saving the lives of the innocent people, we save even the life of this criminal. So this is really very difficult to imagine in our society which theory we are going to really effective in our society to live in harmony. Okay, so that's all for my discussion about this theory. If you have questions or clarifications, feel free to message me in our group chat, and thank you for listening.